All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good day to everybody. My name is Fred Anderson. I'm the Vice President of Sales with Phosphorus. And today we're going to be talking about the Ubiquiti Breach. A little bit of housekeeping items for everybody on the line. All lines are muted during this webinar session. Please use the question panel. Any difficulties with the webinar, to ask any questions. This webinar is also being recorded, and we will be posting this webinar online and emailing that link out to everybody, as well as posted on the new Phosphorus website. Our agenda today, we'll go through the introduction of our speakers. We'll have a discussion around the Ubiquiti breach and how that occurred. How do you find additional resources in securing IoT security? And then a summary of what we just spoke about. Today, we're very grateful for our two speakers, both Chris Rouland and Richard Stiennon are very esteemed security luminaries in the industry today. Chris is the co-founder of Phosphorus. Chris has been a multi-year cybersecurity professional. Richard as well. Richard is a well-known author in the security industry, also a former analyst, and we're grateful to have you both here. So welcome to the presentation, welcome to the webinar and the discussion, and thank you both.
Great to be here, Fred.
Appreciate that. The Internet of Things. Today we're going to be talking about the Ubiquiti breach, but within that, in that concept of what occurred, we just have this gamut of all these IoT devices coming out. As we've seen in the last 90 days of 2021, this is the third significant breach of 2021, and that these IoT breaches are going to continue to occur. And so our discussion today will be around, how do we slow this onslaught, not of the Internet of Things, because we will see billions and billions more of these devices coming, but how do we do a better job at securing what we have today? A little primer on Phosphorus Enterprise. We are an IoT security solution. We find and fix all the IoT vulnerabilities before the threats do. Rather than just segmenting or quarantining your network or trying to hide these IoT assets, we actually provide high fidelity data on the devices on your network. And then also, big differentiation for us, besides just telling you what you see on your network, is going out and finding devices that need to be patched for common CVEs. Also, to enroll these devices, such as Ubiquiti access points, which are IoT devices, into a credential management system. Being able to rotate passwords, being able to change passwords is the basic tenet of framework within the security industry. You would never leave your house and not lock your front door, so you absolutely should be putting passwords and credentials on these IoT devices. And the Phosphorus solution is something that can automate that for the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of IoT devices you have or are deploying currently today on your network. So, to the discussion, Chris and Richard, again, thank you both for being here. Can you give us a little idea on what occurred within Ubiquiti and talk a little bit about how this breach occurred?
Yeah, I can start. There are many ways to analyze and different views you can take of breaches, right? Because there's always the what happened and how did it happen perspective. And obviously that leads to how should the vendor in this case have prevented it from happening. And then there's the case of what do they do afterwards? How do they communicate to the world and their customers what went on? Because quite often you can criticize the breach party for handling that communication process. I think we can criticize Ubiquiti for that as well. And then finally, what should customers of this breach vendor do? So first, let's talk about what happened, right? So we knew Ubiquiti had told us that some customer data or customer accounts had been accessed and everybody should, change your passwords, do something. But then we learned from Brian Krebs, who was in contact with a whistleblower who he dubs Adam, that in actuality, this was a complete breach. In other words, the attackers had complete control over all of Ubiquiti's AWS infrastructure. They had all the credentials, they could create credentials, they had everything. And much like Capital One, which was a similar kind of breach, where the credentials were just kind of leaked. Somebody left them, as they often do, in a GitHub repository. In this case, the attacker got them from somebody's password manager, LastPass, and then was able to use those. They created instances within Amazon of Linux servers, and then after the Ubiquiti teams found all the back doors those guys had left, they threatened to reveal everything they had, source code, customer data, all that good stuff, unless they were paid 50 Bitcoins, which doesn't sound like much, but that's 2.8 million. At the time Brian Krebs was writing, it's probably more today. So devastating breach. This is the worst case scenario. If you have cloud infrastructure, it's for somebody to get administrative control of your cloud infrastructure. And I think I'll pass it to Chris to talk about, there's thousands of customers who have Ubiquiti products. What should they do, right? It's Ubiquiti's saying, yeah, change your passwords to log into your console on AWS. But what does it mean for all these devices that most people don't even know where they are and what they have?
Sure. Thanks for that explanation, Richard. It was very deep, good explanation. And Ubiquiti is no stranger to cybersecurity breaches, as most companies are by this time. They've had some particularly bad ones. I think the worst one I saw was, I recall because I was doing a capital raise myself, and their CFO was fished for $47 million. So, and additionally, they've had 4 or 5 cases of GPL violations going to 2019. Which is also somewhat of a red flag when you're looking at a vendor. If they're violating GPL, it means they are taking open source code, modifying it, and not letting anybody see it. And generally the point of that is you want people to review your code to make sure it's more secure and adhere with the license. So those are all kind of red flags. Ubiquiti products were also involved in Ryan Botnet. Other products like Mikrotik were as well. And in general, I think when you look at companies that compete only on price, they have to sacrifice somewhere. And so a comparable product from Cisco or Aruba might cost 3 or 4 times as much, but there's probably also additional investment. So I personally, in my last house, used Ubiquiti because it was very high performance and very low cost. They also did end up being the backbone of the Mirai botnet that took down Twitter. So, and one thing I think this illuminates is that these hackers also had access to the firmware, which means we don't know if the firmware was tampered with, historically tampered with. We just don't know. And so there could be new vulnerabilities introduced or new malware introduced into future versions of that firmware, and we won't really know it until it happens. So it's always something to consider. And I think it also dovetails, well with the big picture of 2021, with not only Ubiquiti getting totally owned, but Verkada, the camera company, and Sierra Wireless, the guys who make the modems for all the IoT devices. They've all been hacked this year. And so what's happened to your supply chain? Well, if you use any of these items, and odds are a lot of you use Sierra Wireless, if you don't use Ubiquiti, you got to be concerned about that. And it's going down to, now we're not just talking about SolarWinds, we're talking to over-the-air updates to code on embedded devices, and how is that being managed and secured?
And thank you both, Chris and Richard. Any shift in motives that we're seeing, and I know we talked about this year, the 3 major hacks. We go back a little bit further, Garmin and the issues Garmin had in 2020. But do you guys see a shift in motives behind this?
I know I'm looking for that, right? Because SolarWinds, you could say, wow, that was so far the intelligence agencies are saying that was a major espionage campaign. But then, you get to these IoT device hacks, and just it seems to be the motivation of, hey, it's there, so we're going to take it, right? And then, either just cause disruption and get the street cred for being the hackers that did it, or demand a ransom, as they did in the case of Ubiquiti. So right now it's opportunistic, right? If they're vulnerable, the guys are going to find it, which is probably the worst kind, right? It's one thing for a Russian intelligence agency to be targeting a particular company, but you can't say, oh, hey, because SolarWinds was hacked, we're going to be hacked because we don't have any federal agencies as customers. But in an IoT solution, they're just hacking because they can, right? It's easy to do and massive, and there might be some potential gains from it. And that means that all vendors of IoT products have to worry about these kinds of attacks.
Are you another question around the types of, especially in the last two, right? The vulnerability of these breaches seems pretty basic. Is that anything that we could double click on and say, why do you still use default credentials? Again, it's just basic. I think in both cases, a lot had to do with default credentials or easy to guess passwords.
Yeah, certainly for the cloud infrastructure that they're building, right? They should have done their own internal review of how they're storing the cloud access credentials, rotated them, on a regular basis. But that's their administrative level stuff. Down at the end user, if you did regular rotation of credentials for all your IoT devices, you'd get an alert from a supplier like Ubiquiti, and they would say, change your passwords. You'd find it. I did that, a week ago, so I'm probably in pretty good shape because it was after the breach. And then, whether or not you have to go and investigate or monitor traffic to make sure all those devices are behaving properly because they could have had backdoors installed in them in the meantime. That's probably a more sophisticated response.
Chris, you created Phosphorus specifically to address probably a need within IoT. When you compare it against endpoint detection in other areas, is there a specific reason why you went after IoT?
There is. It was one article, and it is represented over and over again. But this article showed a 13-year study of a cyber attack against the University of Wisconsin. And like a good university, they didn't stop it. They studied it for 13 years. And what that study showed was the attack lasted 13 years because of a flaw in a Netgear router. After 7 years, half of them were patched. So if you put that in the context of what the standards we enjoy in desktop computing, whether it's Linux or Microsoft or Apple, we pretty much get an update, all the time. And most enterprises enforce an update at least every 30 days. And we've got a population bigger than all the PCs and servers in the world put together that don't ever patch and don't ever change their passwords. So I saw that as a huge greenfield opportunity to automate something for the market because it was not a manually solvable problem. And it is a hard technical problem to solve at scale. You can't write code for every single IoT device, but if you can abstract it so you're dealing with vendors, we can support massive numbers of devices and provide that same level of server security to these unprotected endpoints today. And we really see people waking up to this risk and see a lot of traction here. And, I think IoT, unfortunately, is a loaded consumerish term, but it's the term we got, and it's one we live with. And to me, it means if it's a computer that can't run software and it has an IP address, it's in our wheelhouse.
What I love about the space is because of both Chris, you and I both have all these years in security, it's so easy to see the future, right? And what products are needed, right? We need, network security for them, and there are a bunch of vendors that do that. We need endpoint security that, can be layered in, and that's something that's out there, even though, we all moved to Windows and nobody ever installed good security on those servers. And you need this, attack surface reduction solutions that are just, now they're part of every compliance regime, right? Got to do it. And all you have to do is say, hey, you've got a whole bunch of stuff that is out of compliance with, how you're supposed to be operating. What are you going to do about it?
Richard, I thank you. I feel you've written about this before, but do you see a difference in security best practices on IoT versus security best practices for devices that can run agent-based products?
Yeah, there is a difference, right? You can't push that agent down to it, right? Especially for the dumb devices, right? They're just telemetry and providing some function, whether it's a temperature sensor on a nuclear power core or controls on a ship, etc. Right? They're chips basically. They're running firmware. There's no way to get to them and do a review of them or analyze the system calls they're making like you can on a CPU. So yeah, that's the primary difference. So it takes a different approach to do the endpoint, attack surface reduction part of it.
Chris, any follow-up to that?
Yeah, I think we see more and more connected things every day. We're always learning, but we do see a network effect in IoT security in that as you develop a corpus of customers, you start to find that your library starts to cover everyone. So that was our biggest concern when we started this company. Our first deployment, we detected 60% of what they had. We said, wow, that's great. The deployment we just did last week, we detected 98% of what they had, because we've identified new types of classes of products, as Richard mentioned. What's the most important IoT device? I get asked all the time. Well, I can tell you, for some of my financial customers, it's the nuclear clock that syncs their trade times. That's the most important IoT device. For other places, it might be the AVM switch that controls 128 servers, or the Tyco door system. And so it's interesting times, because historically the CISO's not been really expected to control these. But when the CISO sees their critical CVEs and thousands of default credentials, and on average, we see 29% of all the IoT in the enterprise is end of life, they perk up and they realize there's something that needs to be done. And what we chose to do is automate that. This is not a manual solvable problem. So with our product, you just click the button and it goes away. And so I think there'll be room in the market for companies like ours to help better solve the problem of these devices not being able to secure themselves.
All right, thank you. Just looking forward, I know we here at Phosphorus recently posted the award that we won from AFWorks regarding IoT and 5G. How do you see the evolution of new communication paths for IoT devices rolling out over the next 3 to 5 years?
5G is truly going to be revolutionary because it gives high bandwidth to every device that can connect. And beyond that, we will have satellite communications that's high speed, so you can get to remote things like oil wells, etc. And they're direct connections. And so far, I haven't seen the motion, though I predicted it 2 years ago, but the telecom providers who own the edge that you connect to should be doing something to secure those connections. But I haven't seen any motion in that direction at all. But it means that the devices, the IoT devices, will be much, much more powerful, right? So yes, streaming video, interactivity, things that you don't need to connect to your home bandwidth in order for them to work. Your cars will have 5G connections in them. Some of them already do. And of course, a car is pretty critical IoT device. And you wouldn't want those to get corrupted over that high-speed network.
Most people don't even think of it as an IoT device.
Yeah. Oh, and as long as we're talking about moving things, how about hypersonic missiles and ships and planes?
All IoT.
Yep.
So one thing that's happened in the world of cellular hacking that really leveled the playing field for the researchers and the vendors was the affordability of the software-defined radio. And I know this in depth because I built the whole company around them. But now the attackers have the ability to sniff packets out of the air that they couldn't sniff before. And so that leads for attacks on 5G itself. Where we see a big opportunity is not necessarily securing the 5G network, it's supporting the populace of the 5G network. What's that little thing on the 5G network that I just put that lithium battery the last 10 years? Where is it? Oh my gosh, it's got a Wi-Fi connection. I can't find it. Now it's a pivot, exfil, egress, hot mic. So not only do these things have almost unlimited battery lives, you know, who knows where they'll end up being. And all of the systems on a chip that support 5G also are nice enough to support Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, making these multi-homed attack tools.
Good point. Good point. So, looking to wrap up, and coming back to the Ubiquiti breach, seems pretty simplistic. Any best practices security professionals should be looking at that you'd like to recommend or remind, I guess, as we close this out?
Well, I know, and I hate it when I hear other security people say this, but you know, okay, a big vendor has been completely breached, so you can no longer, you know, definitely don't trust any products that you have installed on your network coming from them. Okay, find them, you know, and you know, go and do something about them, right? Contain them, patch them, change the passwords, etc. But I know that 90% of the organizations I talk to wouldn't be able to find them, right? They don't make it into their asset control spreadsheets because they don't have tags on them, and they just don't know where they are. And that's the starting place.
All right, thanks, Richard.
Yeah, and I'd say from our side, having had my eyes on over 1 million lines of JSON representing individual IoT devices, is that there's a population of them that just can't be secured, period. And that's something we had to learn to flag. You know, we'd love to fix everything, but you know, the small, maybe less than 1% or less than 0.5% of them, they simply got to go. They can't be secured. And so that's one angle. And I agree with Richard, is that, you know, what's it going to take? So you got Ubiquiti, you got Bricada, you got Garmin. What's it going to take for the Melissa wake up moment when email doesn't work one morning because of IoT? And with the pace and cadence we're on this year, I would expect this year we're going to see something big.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I hate making predictions about future breaches, but it seems like that it's ready.
Well, if the first 3 months of the year were any indication, I believe you're both very accurate and probably right on that course. Well, thank you again for this moment, this discussion. We're grateful to have you two on here. For us here at Phosphorus, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. To contact us, please send us an email. You can go to our, again, new web presence at phosphorus.io. We'd be happy to do a private demonstration. We also have demonstration videos up there. Please follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter for further updates. Richard and Chris, again, very grateful. Thank you both.